If you want to understand a country's present, you must know its past. Preface. Many people may have this question: why did the East and the West, both being ancient and highly developed civilizations, take two completely different roads? Why are there such huge differences between the forms of modernization in European and American countries and China? If you want to get the answer to this question, the best way may not be to analyze the present, but to go back to the past, from the perspective of history, to see what happened to them in the past, so that you can know why they are like this today. Fundamentally speaking, China's history for more than 2,000 years is a cycle of dynasties. These dynasties have similar development processes. They are often led by a wise leader who leads his team to subdue all enemies by force and establish an empire. These empires often recover from war and prosper within 50 to 100 years, and quickly reach their peak. Afterwards, under the influence of some events, these dynasties would gradually slide down from the peak, and their government institutions would become bloated and corrupt. Then, like an old man who is dying, they would perish under the scythe of time. What caused all this? The answer is the starting point and the midpoint of this 2,000 years of history, the Qin dynasty and the Song dynasty. There were two important historical changes in Chinese history, namely the county system reform and the centralization reform of the Qin dynasty, and the tax system reform and the official selection system reform of the Song dynasty. Before the Qin dynasty, China had been developing in a Europeanized method for a long time. There are lots of countries in China, which belonged to a dynasty in a weak degree. The various countries had the same race, but different sorts of currencies, government systems, languages, and cultures. And China's terrain is complex, which is conducive to the formation of a large number of separatist regimes. Therefore, before the Qin dynasty, China adopted a system that nominally had a common monarch but actually split into dozens of countries. This is very similar to the Holy Roman Empire. The central government, which was the Zhou dynasty, had very weak control over the localities, so that people did not think that they belonged to the Zhou dynasty, that they belonged to specific local regimes, such as Qin, Chu, Qi, etc. What changed all this was the regimes, or fundamentally speaking, two people. This regime was Qin, and these two people were Xiangyang and Yingzheng. Xiangyang was the creator of all this at that time. Qin was a remote and not very powerful regime. Such a country had neither strong economic strength nor powerful military force to dominate the world. It only had the ambition to become stronger. Xiangyang provided the means for this goal. He proposed to abolish the old system of feudal nobles ruling localities, and instead implement a county system in which professional bureaucrats appointed by the government ruled localities. This greatly enhanced the power of Qin's central government in terms of localities, giving it more rights and more resources to allocate. Another aspect was the system of universal conscription. He stipulated that all civilians could only choose two paths, farming and soldiering. And he stipulated that all occupations except farmers, officials and soldiers were lowly. This was not a conceptual discrimination, but a systemic one. For example, merchants could not wear clothes made of silk, even though they could afford it. A confusing point is that farmers who endured cruel taxes and were often impoverished were given this right, even though they could hardly afford silk. Artists and their descendants were banned from working for the government for life, etc. But at the same time he stipulated that as long as one served in the army and gained military merit, one could be appointed as a government official and obtain a title. These systems forced people to join the army in large numbers, and made them behave extremely bravely in combat without demanding pay or compensation. As a result, Qin quickly rose and became the strongest among all countries. At this time, power was handed over to a young man with great ambitions. He was Yingzheng. It is worth mentioning that before Yingzheng, a completely unified country only existed in conception. In the dynasties before Qin, such as Xia and Zhou, the monarch would choose to appoint his relatives and loyal ministers as lords of localities, and let them exercise powers such as taxation, justice, and official appointment on his behalf. These people were almost equivalent to European barons or dukes. They were hereditary agents of the central government's power, and had unparalleled power and prestige in localities. Binginning was the first person to try to eliminate them and succeed after using the powerful national strength accumulated by his ancestors to defeat all other local regimes and unify the whole country again. He did not grant fiefs like the previous dynasties, but directly appointed government officials in localities, which was the county system mentioned earlier. Although due to local rebellions, the Qin dynasty disappeared in the dust of history in more than 10 years, it is undeniable that it proposed two reforms that provided a good model for later dynasties. It can be said that later dynasties were to some extent a copy and paste of the Qin dynasty. Even modern China, its political system is very similar to what Qin created, except that, because of the expansion of territory, the concept of county no longer exists, although there are still place names related to it, and it is replaced by a wider province, while centralization is fully retained, and the central government has the highest level of power. Looking back at this huge reform, one has to admit that China actually proposed a very advanced political system at a very early stage. For example, the core of the county system was to use professional bureaucrats instead of feudal lords, which greatly improved efficiency. The fact is that modern civilized countries have also abolished local lords and replaced them with term-limited and non-hereditary professional bureaucrats to effectively rule localities. On this level, China's early maturity and advancement in political system is amazing. No other civilization at the same time could compare with China in terms of system advancement, but unfortunately, China lacked productivity that matched its political system, and under the systematic discrimination against natural scientists and craftsmen, China's productivity progressed very slowly. Although China has a tradition of respecting knowledge, but it is limited to humanities, such as history, rhetoric, and of course the famous Confucianism. Natural scientists were regarded as heretics, and craftsmen were regarded as lowly people. Therefore, the production efficiency of this land has never been greatly improved. The rulers could only try their best to expand the scope of their rule and increase total production. Unfortunately, expansion soon stopped, mainly for two reasons. The first is that China had reached the upper limit of regional boundary. China's north is a barren and extremely barren Siberia, where even now, there are few traces of people. And the east is a vast sea. With the navigation technology at that time, China could hardly reach Australia, and the west is a desert. The only possible south failed after several attempts, mainly because most people were not used to the tropical rainforest climate of Southeast Asia, and with the medical means at that time, it was very difficult to deal with the diseases prevalent in the rainforest. Another reason is the limitation of communication technology. Although in ancient times, China's territory was often larger than it is now, it still relied on horses for information transmission, and government information was often transmitted in months. This limited China's further expansion, just like cells cannot expand indefinitely. Under the limitations of land area and production efficiency, China's total production has always had such an upper limit. Each dynasty reached its peak in total production within a few decades after its establishment, until the country's production could not bear the geometrically increasing population. War would come, most people would die in the fire, and then a small number of people would start another cycle. China has never given up trying to get out of this cycle. Qin's political reform carried the ambition of eternal rule by the monarch, but because of the stagnation of productivity and the limitation of overall strength, various reforms were fundamentally nothing more than strengthening the government's power, and the government's power enhancement meant weakening the power of the people. The people were also impoverished as a result. Qin dynasty quickly perished. Later dynasties mostly learned from Qin's lessons and were more moderate in reforms, but the fundamental problem was not solved. They were like death row inmates who chose to die later. They tried everything to avoid death, but death was eternal. After one cycle after another, China was defeated by Western countries with advanced productivity. In modern times, China finally realized the importance of productivity and embarked on the road of industrialization and modernization after 100 years of twists and turns. But the imprint left by thousands of years of dynastic cycles still exists. This is reflected in many aspects, such as China's tradition of centralization, which is still reflected in contemporary China. And even under the blessing of modern technology, there is a tendency to further strengthen it. There is also the use of professional bureaucrats to directly rule localities, which has also been retained. Therefore, it is also inherited that learning well leads to officialdom. Therefore, you should not be surprised that a large number of young people, they are often PhDs, who have undergone professional training, try their best to enter government work. In the next section, we will further discuss the impact of the Song dynasty reforms on shaping China.